The horizon's edge burned through space at speeds that made the hull groan, and Pete warned Jake that the engines were not designed for this kind of sustained maximum thrust. But Jake did not care, because 30 days was not enough time, and every hour mattered, and if the ship fell apart after they reached Earth, then so be it. When they finally arrived home, Jake sent the emergency codes that brought every military commander and government official to the unified Terran Coalition headquarters in Geneva, and he stood before them in a room that smelled of fear and disbelief, and told them everything that had happened and showed them the recordings of Thralkis and his ultimatum. President Claire Hudson sat at the head of the table, and her face was pale but her voice was steady as she asked the questions that everyone needed answered. And Jake told her that yes, the aliens were real, and yes, they had the technology to destroy Earth, and yes, they had already destroyed 47 other civilizations, and no, he did not think they were bluffing. General Kyle Bennett was a career military man who had fought in the Colony Wars and the Mars Rebellion, and he had seen humanity at its worst and its best, and he leaned forward in his chair and asked the question that was on everyone's mind, which was whether humanity had any chance at all if they chose to fight. Jake wanted to lie and tell them they had a chance, but he had seen the Zarkoth ship and their technology and their casual contempt for everything human, and he knew that in a straight fight humanity would last maybe a day before being wiped from existence, and so he told them the truth, which was that fighting seemed like suicide. Director Nina Torres ran the Colonial Affairs Department, and she was responsible for the 3 million humans living on Mars and Titan and Europa and the asteroid stations. And she stood up and said that surrender was not an option, because once you gave up your freedom, you never got it back, and history had taught humanity that lesson in blood. The debate raged for hours, and some argued for submission because a living slave was better than a dead free man, and others argued for resistance because what was life worth if you spent it on your knees, and Claire listened to all of them and said nothing until the arguing died down and the room fell silent. She stood and walked to the window that looked out over the city where millions of people went about their lives, unaware that their future was being decided in this room. And she spoke quietly, but everyone heard every word. And she said that humanity had crawled up from caves and survived ice ages and plagues and wars and extinction events, and they had done it by refusing to give up even when giving up was the logical choice. Claire said that if the Zarkoth wanted Earth, they would have to take it over the dead bodies of every human who refused to kneel. And if that meant extinction, then humanity would go extinct as free beings. And maybe that would inspire someone else somewhere to resist, and maybe the Zarkoth Empire would eventually fall because of what humanity did here and now. The vote was not unanimous, and 12 members of the council voted for surrender, but the majority voted for resistance, and Claire activated the emergency protocols that had been established after the Colony Wars, and suddenly every factory and shipyard and research facility on Earth and Mars and the Belt was retasked to building weapons and ships and defenses. General Kyle took command of Earth's defense forces, and he knew that conventional military tactics would fail against an enemy with overwhelming technological superiority. So he began recruiting people who thought differently, and one of those people was Ryan Cole, who commanded a destroyer called the Defiant and had a reputation for taking insane risks that somehow worked. Ryan stood in Kyle's office and listened as the general explained the situation and asked him if he was willing to do whatever it took to hurt the enemy, even if it meant sacrificing his ship and his crew and himself. And Ryan did not hesitate. Before saying yes, because he had always known he would die in space, and dying while fighting for humanity's freedom seemed like a good way to go. Nina Torres coordinated the evacuation of non-essential personnel from the outer colonies and brought them back to Earth where they could contribute to the war effort, and she worked 20-hour days and survived on stimulants and coffee and sheer willpower. Because if she stopped moving, she would start thinking about what was coming, and thinking about it would paralyze her. Dr. Helen Wade joined a crash research program that studied every scrap of data Jake's ship had collected about the Zarkoth, and she worked alongside the brightest minds humanity had, and together they tried to find weaknesses in alien technology that seemed to have no weaknesses, and most nights she fell asleep at her desk, dreaming of equations that might save her species. Pete Sullivan took his engineering expertise to the military shipyards and helped design modifications that might give human ships a chance against Zarkoth vessels, and he knew most of his ideas were desperate and probably useless, but he kept working because doing nothing was not an option, and even a 1% improvement in their chances was worth the effort. Jake Morrison found himself promoted to captain and given command of a newly commissioned ship, and he did not want the job because he was a cargo pilot, not a warrior, but Kyle told him that humanity needed people who had faced the Zarkoth and survived and could teach others what to expect, and so Jake accepted and tried to become the leader his crew needed. The 30 days passed in a blur of preparation and fear and defiant hope in humanity, built as many weapons and ships as they could, but everyone knew it would not be enough. And still they built, because the alternative was sitting idle and waiting for death. On the morning of the 31st day, the sensors detected the Zarkoth fleet, and there were 200 warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system, and they were beautiful and terrible, and they moved toward Earth with the confidence of conquerors who had never known defeat. High Admiral Vorthak commanded the fleet, and he broadcast a message to Earth that was simple and final, and he said that humanity's time for surrender had passed, and now they would be made an example of, and any species watching would know the cost of defying the Zarkoth dominion. Claire responded with one word, which was no, and she gave the order that unleashed every ship and weapon and desperate defense that humanity had prepared, and the Battle of Earth began with fire and fury, and a determination that surprised the aliens who had expected quick capitulation. The first wave of human ships accelerated toward the Zarkoth fleet, and they fired everything they had, and the aliens activated their shields, and the human weapons splashed harmlessly against energy barriers that might as well have been solid walls, and within minutes 20 human vessels were reduced to expanding clouds of debris. Ryan Cole watched the destruction from the bridge of the Defiant, and he saw how hopeless it was, and he saw his fellow captains dying, and he made a decision that would change the course of the war, and he ordered his crew to brace for impact, and he pointed his ship directly at a Zarkoth cruiser and pushed the engines past their safety limits. His crew understood what he was doing, and not one of them objected, and the Defiant accelerated to ramming speed, and the Zarkoth cruiser tried to move, but it was too slow and too confident, and the human destroyer struck it amidships, and Ryan triggered the reactor overload in the moment of impact. The explosion tore through the Zarkoth shields, because the shields were designed to stop external attacks, not internal detonations, and the cruiser broke apart, and atmosphere vented into space, and debris rained down on Earth's orbital platforms, and for the first time in 10,000 years, a Zarkoth warship had been destroyed by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. Ryan and his crew died instantly, but their sacrifice was seen by every other human ship in the battle, and suddenly a new tactic was born from desperation and courage, and the willingness to trade life for life instead of accepting slaughter. Ships began ramming attacks all across the battle space, and the Zarkoth fleet suddenly found itself facing an enemy that fought like cornered animals, and the aliens had no doctrine for this because no species had ever been this insane, and every kill they scored cost them ships they could not quickly replace. Vorthak watched from his flagship and felt something he had not experienced in his long military career, which was uncertainty, and he ordered his fleet to pull back to a safer distance and bombard Earth from range where the humans could not reach. Them and his ships began firing planet-killing weapons at the world below, but Earth's orbital defense platforms opened fire and filled the space between the planet and the Zarkoth fleet with missiles and railgun slugs and particle beams, and it was not enough to stop the bombardment, but it was enough to make the aliens pay for every shot, and the battle devolved into a brutal exchange where both sides bled. On the ground, resistance fighters prepared for invasion, and Marcus Wright organized his people in the ruins of New York, and he distributed weapons and explosives and told everyone that if the aliens came down, they would find that conquering Earth's cities would be harder than conquering its orbital space. 3 years had passed since the first battle, and Earth was scarred but still fighting, and the Zarkoth had learned that humans did not break easily, and that conquering a species was different from destroying it, and destruction required resources. They had not anticipated spending on such primitive beings. Admiral Kate Barnes commanded what remained of the Terran fleet, from a hidden base carved into an asteroid in the belt, between Mars and Jupiter, and she had 30 ships under her command, which was nothing compared to the hundreds of Zarkoth vessels patrolling human space. But she used those 30 ships like a surgeon used a scalpel and cut deep where it hurt most. Her tactical officer was Lieutenant Danny Price, and he was young but brilliant, and he had developed the hit-and-run tactics that kept the Zarkoth off balance, and he studied every battle recording and learned from every engagement, and he understood that the key to survival was never fighting fair and never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down. Kate trusted Danny completely because he had saved her life twice, and the fleet's survival a dozen times, and together they planned raids that struck supply convoys and destroyed communication relays, and made the Zarkoth occupation as expensive and difficult as possible. The aliens controlled Mars and Titan and Europa, and they had established garrison bases on Earth in every major city, and they demanded tribute in food and water and metals, and people died by the thousands from starvation and disease and execution, but still humanity resisted. Marcus Wright had become a legend in the underground resistance, and he led fighters who knew every tunnel and sewer and hidden passage in New York, and they ambushed Zarkoth patrols and stole weapons and melted back into the ruins before reinforcements arrived, and the aliens called him the Ghost because they could never catch him. Maya Chen had been a corporate network specialist before the war, and now she used her skills to hack Zarkoth communication systems, and she fed them false intelligence that sent their troops into ambushes and created confusion among their command structure, and every day she sat at her terminal and fought a digital war that was just as important as the physical one. Unoccupied Earth life was brutal, and the Zarkoth showed no mercy to civilians because they believed that sufficient cruelty would break the human spirit, and they executed prisoners in public squares and bombed neighborhoods suspected of harboring resistance fighters and took children as hostages to force compliance. But every execution created 10 new resistance fighters, and every bombing hardened the resolve of those who survived, and the Zarkoth did not understand that humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other and had learned that oppression bred rebellion and cruelty bred hatred, and hatred was a powerful motivator. In a secret facility buried deep beneath the Australian outback, Dr. Helen Wade worked with a team that included physicist Leon Harper and systems analyst Carla Stevens, and they had one mission, which was to find a way to level the technological playing field between humanity and the Zarkoth. Helen had studied the wreckage of destroyed alien ships, and she had found something interesting in their shield generators, which was that they operated on rotating frequency modulations that changed every few seconds to prevent enemy weapons from synchronizing their attacks, and this was brilliant engineering, but it had a flaw. The flaw was that the rotation pattern followed quantum probability mathematics, and while the patterns appeared random, they were actually predictable if you had enough computing power, and Helen had access to every quantum computer humanity had hidden away, and she set them all to work calculating the shield frequency patterns. Leon worked on weaponizing her research, and he developed what they called the Cascade device, which was essentially a virus that could be transmitted to Zarkoth shield generators via quantum entanglement, and the virus would briefly disrupt the frequency rotation, which would create a window of vulnerability lasting maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds was not much, but it was enough for human weapons to penetrate and kill, and Carla designed the delivery system, which required getting within 500 meters of an enemy ship and maintaining a targeting lock for 10 seconds, which was suicidal given how fast Zarkoth vessels could destroy anything that got close. They tested the prototype on wreckage, and it worked perfectly, and then they tested it in a simulation, and it worked most of the time, and then they needed someone willing to test it in actual combat, and Kate volunteered immediately, because if this weapon worked, it could change everything. The mission was planned for a Zarkoth supply depot in the Kuiper Belt, where enemy ships gathered to refuel and resupply, and intelligence provided by Maya's network indicated there would be at least 12 warships present, but the element of surprise might give the humans an advantage. Kate took 5 ships, including her flagship, and they approached the depot from the dark side of a dwarf planet, and they waited until the Zarkoth were in the middle of a refueling operation when their shields were at minimum power, and their attention was focused on logistics rather than security. The human ships accelerated out of hiding, and Danny coordinated the attack with precision timing, and the lead ship armed the Cascade device and closed to within 500 meters of the nearest enemy cruiser, and locked on and transmitted the virus. For 10 seconds nothing happened, and the Zarkoth cruiser began turning its weapons toward the human ship, and Kate thought the device had failed, and she prepared to order a ramming attack. But then the enemy shields flickered and died for exactly 3 seconds. Every human weapon in range fired in that 3-second window, and the Zarkoth cruiser was torn apart by missiles and particle beams and railgun slugs, and it exploded so violently that the shockwave damaged 2 other alien ships nearby. The remaining Zarkoth vessels scrambled to respond, but Kate's ships were already moving to their next targets, and the cascade device was transmitted again and again, and shields failed, and ships died, and within 20 minutes the entire enemy battle group was destroyed or disabled. Kate lost 2 ships in the engagement, and half her crew was dead or wounded, and her flagship was crippled and leaking atmosphere, but they had proven that humans could kill Zarkoth vessels with something other than suicide attacks, and that meant hope. The Admiral ordered a full retreat, and they limped back to the asteroid base, and she immediately sent a message to Helen and Leon and Carla telling them that the cascade device worked, and to begin production immediately, and suddenly the war had a new weapon. Within months, hidden factories across the solar system were producing cascade devices, and human ships began carrying multiple units, and the Zarkoth started losing battles they should have won easily, and their fleet commanders grew cautious and uncertain. High Admiral Vorthak sat in his command center on occupied Earth and studied the reports of increasing losses, and he realized that the humans had found a way to hurt them, and he was furious, because this should have been a simple occupation, but it had turned into the most expensive military campaign in Dominion history. He demanded reinforcements from the homeworlds, and the Conclave of Eternal Light sent them reluctantly, because the Zarkoth Empire was vast, and there were always threats on distant borders, and committing so many resources to subjugate one primitive species was embarrassing. Meanwhile, Ambassador Greg Foster led a small team of diplomats on a dangerous mission to make contact with other species under Zarkoth rule, and they traveled in a modified cargo ship that could barely maintain faster-than-light speeds, and they visited worlds where the people had forgotten what freedom meant. Greg spoke to resistance cells that existed only in whispers and shadows, and he told them about humanity's fight, and he shared tactical information and technical specifications for weapons that could hurt the Zarkoth, and he saw hope kindle in eyes that had been dead for generations. The Keltheran were a reptilian species that had served the Zarkoth for 3,000 years, and they had tried rebellion once and been crushed so thoroughly that they never tried again. But when Greg showed them what humans had accomplished, their leaders began to think that maybe rebellion was possible after all. The Voran were an aquatic civilization, whose oceans had been polluted by Zarkoth mining operations, and their children were dying, and they had nothing left to lose. And when Greg offered them alliance, they accepted and began preparing for war. One by one, Greg contacted species that had suffered under Dominion rule, and he planted seeds of rebellion, and he promised them that they were not alone, and that humanity would stand with them, and some believed him, and some did not. But the seeds were planted. Back on Earth, Marcus Wright led a raid on a Zarkoth command center, and his team included Maya, who had identified a vulnerability in their security systems, and they fought through alien guards and planted explosives, and Maya uploaded a virus into their computers that would spread throughout the occupation network. The command center exploded and took 6 blocks of the city with it, and the virus began corrupting Zarkoth databases and communications, and for 3 days, the occupation forces were blind and deaf, and the resistance used that time to free prisoners and steal weapons and strike targets they had never been able to reach before. Vorthak responded with mass executions, and he declared martial law, and he told his troops to kill anyone who resisted and burn any building. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and watched the stars drift past the viewport, like silent witnesses to humanity's small existence in the vastness of space, and he thought about how routine this mission had become after 3 years of running supplies between Earth and the outer colonies. But routine was good because routine meant survival, and survival meant humanity was still clawing its way forward into the galaxy, one careful step at a time. Lisa Grant sat at the navigation console, and her fingers moved across the holographic display with practiced ease as she plotted their course to Kepler 442b, where miners waited for food and equipment and medicine, and she hummed softly to herself, because the journey was long, and the silence of space could drive a person mad if they let it, and music was her way of keeping the darkness at bay. Pete Sullivan worked in the engine room where the plasma drives hummed with barely contained power, and he wiped sweat from his forehead, because the temperature always ran hot down here. But he preferred it to the sterile cold of the upper decks. And besides, someone had to keep these machines running, and he was the best engineer in the fleet, even if nobody else wanted to admit it. Dr. Helen Wade reviewed medical supplies in the cargo bay and made notes on her tablet about what they would need to requisition when they returned to Earth. and she worried about the miners because space was unforgiving, and accidents happened, and disease spread quickly in enclosed habitats, and she had seen too many people die from preventable causes because help arrived too late. The Horizon's Edge was not a warship, and it was not designed for exploration, and it was just a cargo hauler that carried the necessities of life from one human outpost to another, and Jake was fine with that because humanity had enough problems, without looking for trouble in the unknown regions of space where anything could be waiting. But then the sensors detected something unusual, and Lisa called out from her station that there was an anomalous signal coming from a system that was not on any of their charts, and Jake felt a familiar tingle of curiosity that he had learned to ignore over the years because curiosity killed cats and probably killed starship commanders too. He almost ordered Lisa to ignore it and continue on their planned route. But something made him hesitate, and he thought about how humanity had reached the stars by being curious and bold, even when it was dangerous. And maybe they owed it to themselves to investigate just this once, and so he gave the order to change course, and Lisa adjusted their trajectory, and the Horizon's Edge turned toward the unknown. The journey took 6 hours, and during that time Pete complained about the detour, because it was burning fuel they might need later, and Helen worried about the miners who were expecting their supplies on schedule, and Lisa kept checking her instruments to make sure the signal was still there, and Jake second-guessed his decision 100 times but kept his doubts to himself, because a captain had to appear confident, even when he felt anything but. When they finally arrived at the source of the signal, they found something that should not have existed according to everything humanity knew about this region of space, and it was a massive structure orbiting a dead star, and the structure was clearly artificial and clearly not human, and clearly far more advanced than anything humanity had ever built. Jake stared at it through the viewport and felt his mouth go dry because this was first contact, and humanity had wondered for centuries if they were alone in the universe, and now they had their answer, and he was not sure if he should feel excited or terrified, and he settled on both. Lisa ran scans of the structure and her voice shook slightly as she reported that it was giving off energy signatures consistent with active power systems and life support and weapon emplacements, and she estimated it was at least 50 times larger than the biggest space station humanity had ever constructed, and Jake told her to keep scanning and maintain a safe distance. Pete came up from the engine room because he wanted to see this with his own eyes, and he whistled low when he caught sight of the alien structure and said that whoever built it had technology that made human engineering look like children playing with blocks, and Jake told him to get back to his station and be ready to run if things went wrong. Helen joined them on the bridge, and she had a medical scanner in her hand, as if she might need to treat alien injuries, and Jake almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but he was too tense to find humor in anything, and he wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his career by coming here. The structure suddenly came alive with lights that blazed across its surface in patterns that might have been communication, or warning, or simple acknowledgement of their presence, and then a portion of the structure detached itself and began moving toward the Horizon's Edge, and Jake realized it was a ship, and it was moving fast, and there was no way they could outrun it. He ordered battle stations even though they had no real weapons to speak of, and Lisa plotted 3 different escape routes, even though she knew none of them would work, and Pete diverted power to the shields, even though their shields were designed to stop micrometeorites, not alien weapons, and Helen stood quietly and waited because there was nothing else any of them could do. The alien ship pulled alongside them, and it was sleek and elegant and deadly looking, and it made the Horizon's Edge look like a garbage scow, and then a voice came over their communication system speaking perfect English, and the voice was cold and amused and filled with contempt. The voice said that they were the Zarkoth Dominion, and they had ruled this region of space for 10,000 years, and humanity had violated their territory, and would now face the consequences of their ignorance, and Jake tried to respond, but the words stuck in his throat because he knew with absolute certainty that everything was about to change. A blinding light filled the bridge, and when it faded there were aliens standing among them, and they were tall and crystalline and beautiful in a way that made Jake think of ice sculptures, and their leader stepped forward and looked at the humans, with eyes that held no warmth and no mercy and no recognition of them as equals. The leader introduced himself as Ambassador Commander Thralkis, and he walked slowly around the bridge examining their equipment and technology with barely concealed disdain, and he touched nothing because touching would have implied their creations had value, and clearly he believed they had none. Thralkes spoke, and his words were translated by technology far beyond human understanding, and he told them that humanity was primitive and weak and insignificant, and that Earth and all human colonies would now belong to the Zarkoth Dominion, and humanity would serve or humanity would die, and the choice was theirs to make. Jake found his voice, and he tried to negotiate, and he tried to reason, and he tried to explain that humanity had no quarrel with the Zarkoth, and surely there was room in the galaxy for both their civilizations to exist peacefully. And Thralkes laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. The alien commander said that 47 species had stood where Jake stood now, and 47 species had either submitted or been destroyed, and humanity would be 48 on that list, and there would be no negotiation, and no compromise, and no mercy for those who refused the inevitable. Thralkes returned to his ship and took samples of human technology with him, as if collecting specimens from a museum, and before he left, he gave Jake a message to deliver to Earth, and the message was simple and clear, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. Humanity had 30 days to surrender completely, or the Zarkoth would come in force and erase every trace of human existence from the galaxy, and they had done it before, and they would do it again, and Jake believed every word. The alien ship departed, and the horizon's edge was left alone in the darkness, and nobody spoke for a long time, because what was there to say? And finally, Jake ordered Lisa to set course for Earth at maximum speed, because humanity needed to know what was coming, and they needed every second they could get to prepare. As the stars blurred past and the ship raced toward home, Jake sat in his command chair and thought about the choice that faced his species, and he thought about freedom and survival, and whether those two things could coexist, and he knew that in 30 days, the universe would have its answer. Year 5 of the war arrived, and Earth was a planet of ghosts and rubble, but the ghosts still fought, and the rubble hid weapons and warriors who refused to die, and the Zarkoth occupation had become a nightmare that consumed resources and ships and soldiers, with no end in sight. The rebellion that Greg Foster had planted across the galaxy suddenly bloomed into open warfare, when the Keltheran launched coordinated attacks on every Zarkoth installation in their home system, and they used tactics learned from humans and weapons designed from stolen specifications, and within days they had liberated 3 planets. The Vorin followed, and their aquatic commandos attacked underwater Zarkoth mining facilities and destroyed them utterly, and the polluted oceans began to heal, and Vorin warriors who had been slaves became soldiers fighting for their children's future. The Pralket rose up and the Sindari rebelled, and the Corvin launched guerrilla campaigns, and within months, 14 species across the Dominion were in open revolt, and the Zarkoth military found itself stretched impossibly thin, trying to suppress multiple uprisings simultaneously. High Admiral Vorthak screamed at his subordinates and demanded to know how primitive species that had accepted Dominion rule for centuries were suddenly coordinated and equipped and fighting effectively, and his intelligence officers told him that humanity had done this, and he realized too late that humans were more dangerous as symbols than as warriors. The Conclave of Eternal Light convened an emergency session on the Zarkoth homeworld, and they debated whether to commit even more forces to suppressing the rebellions, or to withdraw and consolidate their remaining territory. And the debate grew, heated because admitting defeat was unthinkable, but continuing these wars was becoming economically impossible. On Earth, General Kyle Bennett coordinated with resistance leaders from across the galaxy through quantum communication networks that Maya had established, and he shared everything humanity had learned about fighting the Zarkoth, and he felt pride that his species had sparked something greater than their own survival. Kate Barnes received intelligence that the Zarkoth were planning one final devastating attack on Earth to break humanity completely and make an example that would terrify other rebellious species back into submission, and the attack fleet would consist of 50 warships carrying enough firepower to crack the planet. She had 40 ships under her command now because production facilities on hidden asteroid bases had been working non-stop, and human engineering had improved with each generation of vessels, and the newest ships carried multiple cascade devices and armor that could withstand more punishment and weapons that hit harder. Danny Price planned the defensive strategy, and he knew they could not stop 50 Zarkoth warships through conventional combat, so he designed a battle plan that relied on chaos and desperation and the willingness to die if it meant taking enemies with them. The Zarkoth fleet arrived, and High Admiral Vorthak himself commanded from his flagship, determined to witness humanity's extinction personally, and he broadcast a message to Earth, telling them that their resistance had ended and their world would be destroyed, and there would be nothing left but asteroids and memories. President Claire Hudson sat in a bunker beneath Geneva, and she was old now and tired, but her voice was strong when she responded, and she told Vorthak that humanity had heard threats before, and had survived them all, and would survive this one too, and then she gave the order to launch everything. Kate led the human fleet out from behind the moon where they had been hiding, and they accelerated toward the enemy formation in attack patterns that looked suicidal, because they were, and the Zarkoth opened fire with weapons that turned space into a storm of energy and death. Human ships died in the first minutes, and the Defiant II, commanded by Ryan Cole, who had survived the original Defiant's destruction by being on leave, was hit and spun away, trailing atmosphere. But Ryan kept his ship in the fight and fired every weapon he had until the power failed. Danny coordinated the attack from Kate's flagship, and he directed ships to specific targets and triggered cascade devices in sequence to maximize the window of vulnerability, and human weapons poured through the gaps in Zarkoth shields, and alien vessels began exploding. Orbital defense platforms that had been rebuilt after previous battles fired railgun slugs at relativistic speeds, and the slugs punched through shields that were already weakened by cascade attacks, and 3 Zarkoth cruisers were torn apart by weapons moving at significant fractions of light speed. On the ground, Marcus Wright led teams that operated massive railguns built into mountainsides and hidden under cities, and these weapons fired up through the atmosphere and added their fire to the battle, and the Zarkoth had never faced a planet that could fight back so effectively. The battle raged for 16 hours, and space around Earth became a graveyard of shattered ships, both human and alien, and the Zarkoth fleet was supposed to overwhelm Earth's defenses easily, but instead found itself in a desperate struggle for survival. Ryan Cole rallied enough power to move his crippled ship, and he aimed it at Vorthak's flagship and pushed the failing engines to ramming speed, and his crew knew what he intended, and not one of them objected, and the Defiant II became a missile one final time. But Ryan did not ram the flagship because he had a better idea, and he took his ship into the flagship's hangar bay, which was open because the Zarkoth were launching fighters, and he crashed through the atmospheric barrier and detonated his fusion reactor inside the enemy ship. The explosion tore through Vorthak's flagship from within and destroyed bulkheads and power systems, and breached the command deck where the High Admiral stood, and Vorthak had time to realize he had been killed by the very species he had dismissed as primitive before the Void claimed him. The Zarkoth fleet lost cohesion when their commander died, and Kate pressed the attack, and human ships swarmed the confused aliens and triggered cascade devices and fired weapons and rammed when nothing else worked, and the battle turned into a slaughter. By the time the Zarkoth fleet commander, who had survived Vorthak's death, ordered a retreat, they had lost 43 ships, and the remaining 7 vessels fled toward the edge of the system and jumped to faster-than-light speed as soon as they could. Earth had lost 31 ships and thousands of crew members, and the orbital defense platforms were silent and shattered, and the planet itself bore fresh scars, but humanity had won and driven off an attack that should have been their end. Maya Chen immediately broadcast recordings of the battle across every communication channel that reached beyond Earth, and she made sure that every species under Zarkoth rule saw how the mighty Dominion had been beaten and sent running by humans who refused to kneel. The news spread like wildfire across the galaxy, and resistance movements that had been planning and preparing suddenly launched full-scale uprisings, and the Zarkoth found themselves fighting wars on 100 worlds, and their military was collapsing under the strain. The conclave of eternal light descended into chaos as different factions argued about how to salvage the situation, and hardliners wanted total war and extermination of every rebellious species, while moderates argued that the Empire could not sustain such massive military commitments and needed to negotiate. The internal debate turned violent, and Zarkoth military commanders began choosing sides, and civil war erupted within Dominion space, and suddenly, the Empire that had ruled for 10,000 years was tearing itself apart. Greg Foster met with leaders from the Keltheran and Voran and a dozen other liberated species, and together they formed the Coalition of Free Worlds and pledged mutual defense and support, and declared that the age of empires built on slavery was ending. General Kyle Bennett began coordinating coalition military forces, and he found himself commanding not just humans, but warriors from species who had suffered under the Zarkoth for longer than human civilization had existed, and together they planned the final offensive. Kate Barnes was promoted to Supreme Commander of Coalition Forces, and she stood on the bridge of her rebuilt flagship and looked at the fleet assembled around her and saw ships from 20 different species, all united by a common purpose, and she felt hope for the first time in years. Danny Price studied the strategic situation and reported that the Zarkoth were divided and weakened, and their empire was crumbling, but they still controlled their home system and their most powerful remaining forces, and if the Coalition wanted to end the war, they needed to strike at the heart of the Dominion. The Coalition fleet numbered 300 ships, and it was the largest combined force in galactic history, and it represented species that had been enemies and slaves and conquerors, but were now allies, and Kate gave the order to advance, and the fleet jumped to faster-than-light speed, heading for the Zarkoth homeworld. On Earth, Marcus Wright walked through the ruins of New York and saw people rebuilding and planting gardens in bomb craters and teaching children in makeshift schools, and he realized that humanity had not just survived, but had shown the galaxy what resistance looked like, and that legacy would outlive them all. The Coalition fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Zarkoth home system and faced the last major defense force the Dominion could muster, and there were 150 warships arrayed in defensive formations around their homeworld, and these were not occupation vessels but elite guard ships crewed by warriors who had never known defeat. Kate stood on her flagship's bridge and studied the enemy formation, and she knew this would be the bloodiest battle of the war, because the Zarkoth were fighting for their home, and desperate enemies were dangerous, and beside her Danny worked his tactical displays and plotted attack vectors that might give them an advantage. The Keltheran war chief Kralvin commanded a wing of the Coalition fleet, and he contacted Kate and told her his people had waited 3,000 years for this moment, and they would not fail, and Kate told him that today they would show the galaxy that tyranny had an expiration date. The battle began when both fleets launched their opening salvos in space filled with missiles and energy beams, and the darkness between stars became bright with weapons fire, and ships began dying on both sides, and the void claimed warriors who had fought too long and survived too much to fall now. Human ships used every tactic they had developed over 7 years of desperate warfare, and they swarmed and scattered in coordinated cascade device attacks that brought down shields and allowed Coalition weapons to penetrate, and Zarkoth vessels exploded in brilliant flashes that briefly lit the faces of those who had suffered under their rule. The Vorin deployed their newest warships that moved through space like they moved through water, and their weapons fired in patterns that confused Zarkoth targeting systems, and they struck from unexpected angles and vanished before retaliation could be coordinated. The battle raged for hours, and the Coalition fleet pressed forward accepting losses because they had numbers and momentum, and 7 years of anger to fuel them, and the Zarkoth fought with the desperation of those who knew they were watching their civilization end. Kate's flagship took heavy damage, and life support failed on 3 decks, and fires burned in the engineering section, but she refused to retreat, and Danny kept feeding targeting data to Coalition ships even as their own vessel shuddered under enemy fire. Ryan Cole, who had somehow survived both Defiant vessels being destroyed, now commanded a squadron of fighters, and he led them through the chaos toward the Conclave's orbital fortress, where the Zarkoth leadership was desperately trying to coordinate their crumbling defense. The fortress was heavily shielded and protected by point defense weapons that made approaching it suicide. But Ryan had Maya Chen aboard his fighter, and she had equipment that could hack Zarkoth systems if she could get close enough, and Pete Sullivan was there too, with explosives powerful enough to breach the fortress hull. They dodged through defensive fire and lost half their squadron in the approach, but Ryan kept flying, and Maya kept working her magic on the fortress systems, and suddenly a window opened in the shields, and the remaining fighters dove through. Ryan crashed his fighter into the fortress hangar bay, and the impact killed 3 of his crew, but he and Maya and Pete survived, and they fought their way through Zarkoth guards who could not believe that primitive humans had breached their most secure facility. Maya found a terminal and connected her equipment and began shutting down internal defenses and opening doors that should have been sealed, and Pete placed his explosives on structural supports that would collapse entire sections if detonated. They fought deeper into the fortress and left a trail of dead guards behind them, and finally they reached the chamber where the Conclave of Eternal Light cowered and watched their empire die on holographic displays that showed the battle outside. Ryan kicked open the door and aimed his weapon at the Zarkoth leaders, and they looked at him with crystalline eyes that held fear and disbelief. And he wanted to kill them, but he had orders to take them alive if possible. He told them that their empire was over and their fleet was breaking and their civilization would survive only if they surrendered completely and ended the killing. And one of the Conclave members tried to activate a hidden weapon, but Pete shot him before he could complete the motion. The remaining Conclave members saw that resistance was futile, and they authorized the surrender order, and Maya transmitted it across all Zarkoth military channels, and slowly, reluctantly, the enemy warships began standing down, and the battle ended. The coalition had lost 130 ships and tens of thousands of warriors. But the Zarkoth home guard was destroyed, and their government had surrendered, and suddenly a war that had seemed endless was over. Kate sat in her damaged flagship and felt exhaustion wash over her, and Danny reported casualties and ship status, and she listened with half her attention, because the other half was thinking about everyone who had died to reach this moment and whether it had been worth it. On Earth, President Claire Hudson received the news, and she addressed humanity and the coalition species and told them that freedom had been won, but peace would be harder, because building was more difficult than destroying, and they would need to be as brave in peace as they had been in war. The Zarkoth Empire was dissolved, and war crimes tribunals were established, and Dominion leadership faced justice for 10,000 years of oppression. And some were executed, and some imprisoned, and some younger Zarkoth who had questioned the empire were allowed to help build a new government. The liberated species formed the Coalition of Free Worlds into a permanent alliance, and they wrote a charter that protected individual species sovereignty while providing mutual defense and economic cooperation, and humanity was a founding member despite being the youngest spacefaring civilization. Greg Foster became the first Coalition Secretary General, and he worked to heal the wounds between species who had been enemies and slaves and conquerors, and it was difficult work but necessary work, and he was good at it. Dr. Helen Wade opened research, facilities that shared technology freely across the Coalition, and species that had been held back by Zarkoth restrictions suddenly leaped forward, and new discoveries came daily, and the galaxy entered a golden age of innovation. Admiral Kate Barnes retired and returned to Earth and walked through cities that were rebuilding, and she saw human children playing with Keltharan and Vorin children, and she knew that something beautiful had emerged from all the horror. Marcus Wright helped establish the memorial in New York where his resistance cell had fought for years, and the memorial listed every name of every being who died in the war, and the inscription said that they had called humanity primitive, but primitive. Beings do not inspire galaxies to rise up and fight. On a colony world that had been freed from Zarkoth rule, Maya Chen trained the next generation of intelligence officers and taught them that information was a weapon as powerful as any cascade device, and that knowing your enemy was the first step to defeating them. Pete Sullivan designed the new generation of Coalition starships that incorporated technology from 20 species, and he was proud that his engineering would be used for exploration and defense rather than desperate survival. Ryan Cole was given command of the Coalition fleet, and his flagship was crewed by warriors from a dozen worlds, and they patrolled the borders and ensured that no new empire would rise to replace the old one. 20 years after the war ended, Jake Morrison stood before the memorial in New York, and his hair was white and his body was old, but his eyes were clear, and Lisa Grant stood beside him holding her grandson, and Pete was there with his cane, and Helen came with flowers. They had survived when survival seemed impossible, and they had inspired a revolution when revolution seemed futile, and they had changed the galaxy forever by simply refusing to kneel. Jake looked up at the stars that were now filled with free beings living their lives without masters, and he remembered Thralkis, who had called humanity primitive. And he smiled because primitive species do not shatter empires. They just refuse to give up, and sometimes that is enough to change everything. The galaxy was not perfect, and there were still conflicts and problems in species that struggled, but the age of vast empires built on slavery was over, and that was worth every sacrifice. Humanity had come to the stars as children and been dismissed as primitive and told to kneel, and instead they had stood up and fought and shown the galaxy what determined beings could accomplish, and now they walked among the stars as equals. The Zarkoth dominion that had ruled for 10,000 years was gone, and in its place was something better, and humanity had been the spark that lit the fire, but the fire belonged to everyone who had suffered and fought and refused to accept that might made right. Jake touched the memorial wall where Ryan Cole's name was carved, and he thought about all the brave people who had given everything so others could be free, and he was grateful and sad and proud all at once. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and that was all anyone could ask for. And as the sun set over the rebuilt city, Jake Morrison knew that humanity's greatest achievement was not the technology they had developed or the battles they had won, but the simple truth they had shared with the galaxy. Freedom is worth fighting for, and no being should kneel before another, and when you stand together, even the impossible becomes possible. And,